Russian, French, and American leaders are crisscrossing Africa to win support for their positions on the war in Ukraine against what some say is the most intense competition for influence on the continent since the Cold War. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and French President Emmanuel Macron were on diplomatic shuttles to Africa, with each of the duo visiting several countries on the continent. Samantha Power, head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, went to Kenya and Somalia. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, also booked for Ghana and Uganda. Lavrov, in his travels across the continent, sought to portray the West as the villain, blaming it for rising food prices, while the Western leaders have accused the Kremlin of using food as a weapon and waging an imperial-style war of conquest, words calculated to appeal to listeners in post-colonial Africa. Now joining us to discuss the renewed interest of the West and Russia in Africa is Farai Muvuti, founder of South African Times. Good to have you on Newsday, Farai. Thanks so much for joining us. Now,
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Now, in your own opinion, what would you say is driving this renewed interest in Africa, and which side is likely to gain the upper hand?
Well, yet again, thank you so much for having me. I suppose what is driving this new interest, I think in the context of Russia, it isn't really a new interest. Russia and African relations go back as far as the 70s, during the period of decolonization, if you will. This is in light of the partnerships that Russia had with countries such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria itself. And so I suppose in the context of the current climate, where Africa tends to be at the back burner of global agendas, as it were, I suppose this new sort of interest to garner African support in light of the Ukrainian war, this is of course the West and Russia itself, really is an opportunity rather for Africa to continue to pivot its own issues within the context of bilateral relations, as well as its own geopolitical concerns, engineered by of course its own domestic policy. So in this instance, what we are seeing is that Russia and of course the global North are trying to garner support. One, of course, in defense of the proposition of Russia, and the other, of course, against what they deem to be an illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory.
And we know that there is a global food insecurity. We know specifically the grain shortages caused by the war in Ukraine. And we also know that Sergei Lavrov is making his tour around certain African countries. Do you think he's going to be able to convince them that grain supplies will not stop as the war continues?
I think one thing that is certain is that, and one thing that a lot of media outlets have not acknowledged, is that part of the reasons why you currently have the deal signed in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine is as a consequence of African lobbying. If you recall, the president of Senegal, as chairman of the AU, Mr. President Sall, went to Putin and made the case that grain imports were critical to certain parts of the African countries purely because, of course, they require the wheat supply as well as fertilizer, but fundamentally because of the inflationary sort of causation that would occur as a consequence of global food prices, which will have an impact on countries which are emerging, such as Africa. So they made that argument successfully before the involvement of the UN and before the subsequent agreement came into play. But this was as a consequence of the AU itself leveraging its position within the geopolitical complexities, as it were, and they equally were able to use it in a very sophisticated fashion. So for that, they should be given kudos, because they were able to clearly leverage their neutrality and get something done. So that was Africa's doing, and I think we don't get a lot of support for that. So in terms of the question, which is Russia doing enough to convince? In that regard, I think Russia has of course work to do in relation to whether it is convincing. But I'll also challenge the premise of the question, because I think we often look at these issues in a binary sense, forgetting that Africa equally has has a non-aligned approach because of the non-aligned movement. And most African countries are members of the non-aligned movement, which actually supports a non-interventionist approach to domestic politics. So they do not support the sanctions. So they equally would not. So in as much as there are some African countries that condemned Russia in its voting, in their voting, they still do agree that the threshold of punishment, in as far as sanctions are concerned, have a subsequent consequence on their own global price points. So Africa is playing a very sophisticated geopolitical engagement in as far as it does not want to be at odds with the West in as far as its engagement, but equally does not want to be at odds with Russia. So it's a very balanced sort of appeal. And this goes far back to even when the war began, when President Ramaphosa of South Africa agitated that there must be a cool-headed approach in as far as how we deal with this issue. And a consensus amongst a number of African states was a neutral approach that is sober-minded, that will equally factor in global consequences as a result of decisions that may have been made from a global perspective, in be it finance and which of course we've seen the impact of as we are currently seeing the rising fuel prices, oil and gas, and so forth. But one must not ignore that it equally creates opportunities for Africa. But to answer your question directly, I think there's work to be done, but I do not necessarily think that it's a work of convincing, because it's about joint bilateral relations and whether Russia can equally meet Africa's most independent African countries as they have been approached their independent objectives.
All right, Farai. Of course, this particular argument actually was probably demonstrated just last week with Sergei Lavrov and also President Macron all visiting key states in Africa to probably push for more diplomatic, and not just diplomatic, also commercial trade balances, so to speak, with Lavrov even saying that the shortages of food in Africa, for example, is being caused by the West, and the sanctions being brought by the West on Russia. Have we come to the stage as an entity in Africa that we begin to demand what we get from the West, whether it be from France, with France trying to actually open more diplomatic doors in those countries, in those Francophone countries, or even to Russia, or maybe even to the US? Spread this for me.
I think this is a very interesting question, and it speaks to the sophisticated approach towards dealing with the geopolitical complexities that we're currently facing. And I think a number of African countries have been able to look at this quite carefully and begin to use this as leverage for themselves as well. So one of the things that a lot of African countries are doing is really, one, looking at what are the underpinning issues that they are concerned about. And over the years, we've seen Africa being put on the agenda, on the global agenda, be it issues relating to climate change, which has hit a number of African countries quite severely, issues relating to food security, self-sustenance, and a quest for a fuller integration and getting our voice being heard within the UN multilateral institutions as well. And I think what the AU has been able to demonstrate is to navigate these issues quite cleverly, if you will, by leveraging. So an example I put to you earlier was the intervention of the AU when it came to prompting Russia to actually have an agreement that released grain. It's a demonstration of leverage that is very critical in as much as the UN then gets involved in the latter stages. But that particular push demonstrated Africa's leverage. If we can continue in that manner, it means that Africa's agenda can be equally put within the context of the multiple challenges that we're facing with the current confluence amongst Western nations, if you will.
Well, now, Farai, during his visit to Africa, Lavrov voiced support for reforms of the UN Security Council. He says that he's demanding for African countries to get permanent seats and greater influence. How likely is that?
Well, the likelihood of it is one thing, But the mere fact that Lavrov clearly understood what is at the heartbeat of a number of African foreign policymakers is critical. So an understanding of the fact that Africa has continuously raised arguments about its lack of representation in the security sector, as far as the UN is concerned, its voice being heard on multiple organs as far up as the WHO, as recently seen during the pandemic, where we had what a number of analysts termed the imperialist sort of distribution of vaccines. All these inequalities is as a consequence of our lack of parity in multilateral institutions, and Russia recognizing that as a starting point. What the Americans will do, of course, as they continue, as we will see Blinken travel to Ghana, South Africa, and Rwanda in the next coming days, is going to be quite interesting in terms of the proposals they will make. But yet again, to reiterate this, it demonstrates that African countries are being much more sophisticated in their approach in light of their colonial history, but more so in light of the present conditions, which are as recent as COVID, in which we were the last to participate in the distribution of vaccines, and a number of countries continue to struggle to this very day. So for Africa now, Ukraine presents a backdrop to equally put ourselves on the agenda, and to not be swayed, as it were, by binary arguments such as Africa taking that side or this side. These are very binary arguments. African issues are very complex and very multiple. And I think, to echo the sentiments shared by the president of Uganda, Museveni, when he said that we will not be told who our enemies are, nor will we be told who our friends are, sort of echoes the sentiments of the non-aligned movement, which is the underpinning principle of most African countries.
And really quickly, Farai, because it seems we've run out of time, speaking of those multi-layered issues that we have as African countries, it seems we're all aware that the Sahel region is going through a heavy spate of insecurity, with individual countries heavily battling insurgents on their own metal, and also there have been calls for mercenaries, foreign mercenaries, sometimes to help to address this situation. We do know that Russia does have such applications, especially with the Wagner Group and their presence in such countries as Sudan, etc. Any discussions about countering the insurgency uptick in the Sahel region of Africa, knowing that France is also working on such as well?
Well, I think it's equally a deep-seated insecurity that perhaps the French president may have as well, considering his comments during his African tour, in which he cited that most African countries were being hypocritical. And it's quite rich, considering French history and its continued preoccupation with the number of Francophone states and as far as their monetary policy is concerned. But the continued so the competing forces within that area do speak to a destabilization of French foreign policy, and that is a real fright. However, how it plays out in the long term is yet to be seen.
All right, Farai, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on Newsday.